So for example, pain and suffering. Everyone knows, all lawyers know, pain and suffering is pled in a complaint or however it might be used or referred to. And in mindfulness, that's a very clear application. So in mindfulness, what we do is we recognize that pain is in this world. We will experience painful events, but will we suffer on top of it, right? And it's the mind that relates to the painful event by resisting it that creates the suffering. The pain itself, if we can move in and embrace it, and so in the jurist sense, that phrase is, may I approach, right? You know, not may I approach the bench, but may I approach the pain, right? Permission to approach. And the answer is yes, because when we embrace the pain, that's easier said than done, but it's something that we can do. We all can embrace the pain of our life, but all of a sudden we experience it differently and the suffering comes down. So in talking with lawyers about it, the general idea is, well, the more pain, the more suffering. The more you experience the pain, the more you suffer. If you're pleading for damages and you're going to get pain and suffering, well, the more pain you can show, the more suffering the more dollars you're going to get. That's the natural way that we tend to relate to pain and suffering. But in mindfulness, it's the inverse, right? The more we experience the pain, the less we suffer. And that's a concept that people enjoy talking about, and it makes you think and wonder, and it also speaks to this deeper truth about us and our experience. And so it begins to create the opportunity for a person to begin to play with this notion so that in their own life they can see what's that like. And when a person hears that, they only have to wait about 5 or 10 minutes before their first painful event's going to happen. Something's going to happen that they're going to be resisting to, and can they begin to allow it just to be the way it is? And so that's pain and suffering. Attractive nuisance is another one. So we all know these cases, these not particularly pleasant cases that go way back about 100 or so years with these kids that were playing in these open fields and they found this pool, the poison pool, and it was very inviting, so they jumped on in, and unfortunately it was toxic and they passed away, died. Well, our mind has these places, the landscape of our mind has these poison pools, has these attractive nuisances where we tend to go again and again and again. It might be doubt, it might be worry, it might be fear, it might be regret. We all have these places, and sometimes a couple of them, that our mind tends to wander to over and over again. Why? It is not pleasant, it is toxic, right? And yet we go there again and again. So we'll talk about attractive nuisance to say, yes, you know, there are these places, and everyone knows what these places are, and they all wonder, why do I go there? Why do I keep going back to that same pattern of thought? And this gets into the neuroscience, of course, because this is our conditioned mind. And what we've learned is that it's conditioned to do this, but we can recondition it by relating to our experience differently. And so that's attractive nuisance and how that particular term is used. Hearsay, you know, in the law, hearsay is an out-of-the-court statement that's introduced for the truth of the matter asserted. In jurist, hearsay is sort of an out-of-the-mind statement, right? Or out-of-the-mind thought that's believed to be the truth. So often we believe the thoughts that come in our head as if they're the truth. Well, if it were hearsay, you would challenge it and you would suggest, objection, hearsay. Maybe this ought not be admitted into evidence, right? Well, let's do this with our own thoughts. We have about 50 or 60,000 of them during the day. Let's investigate some of our own thoughts by saying objection, hearsay, especially if they don't feel right, especially if they cause us to suffer. You know, what is that's going on with this? Like law students, I'm going to fail this test, and if I fail this test, I'm never going to get the objection, hearsay. Are you really going to fail the test? Well, I don't know. And it begins to shift the way we relate to these experiences that we just sort of are jumping in out of habit. And then, of course, the relief and then the clarity of mind follows from it. And so that would be how hearsay is introduced. And so there's a whole series of these legal terms that introduces these fundamental mindfulness concepts like that. And so what's really exciting is this application of neuroscience to everyday life, but in particular to the life of a lawyer who wants to be effective, who wants to be able to relate to other people, who wants to be able to, as part of that effectiveness, be able to remember, to have a learning curve that moves up, that doesn't get flat and fall off. And so what the neuroscience is showing us is, first and foremost, this thing called neuroplasticity. Right? It used to be believed not that long ago, and quite fervently believed by the medical community, that after you were just a handful of years old, your brain was pretty much in place, and there wasn't going to be a whole lot of growth, or certainly changes in the way this brain is structured, and for that matter, by and large, functions. There was still growth to happen as you got a little bit older into the 20s, and then it was pretty much done. What we now know is that it never stops. It never stops. While we've been sitting here, our brains have been changing. The structure and function of our brain has been shifting and is fluid, very much based on what our experience is and how we choose to relate to that experience. That's where it's most interesting. It's not just that our brain changes. That's fascinating enough and quite eye-opening, but rather how we choose to think about, how we choose to experience this world very much influences the way it changes as well, and in some ways in remarkably beneficial and extraordinary ways in terms of what it offers us as human beings, and then we can offer those around us. So, for example, the most interesting research has come about with regards to an area called not just neuroplasticity, but an aspect of neuroplasticity which is neurogenesis, the growth of neurons, right? You probably remember when you were younger, I certainly remember, if you lose a brain cell, it's never coming back. Well, the fact is that we now know that not only can the synaptic connections wiring neurons together change, and that's very big and important in and of itself, not only can neurons begin to take on different functions, what was seeing can now begin to hear, which the brain decides is very important given the circumstances of a person's life. Those are phenomenal findings, but in addition, neurons can actually grow. So in mice studies, we found early on, this was in the 90s, so when I say early on, I mean just 20 or so years ago, we found that mice who exercised in these nice environments that were rich and robust had, as a result of that exercise, neurons grow in their hippocampus. Now the hippocampus is the memory center of the brain. It's very responsible for integrating memory as well as emotion in certain respects. And here we found that neurons were growing in the hippocampus in these mice. Now, the phenomenalness of that had a lot to do with the exercise, that there was this brain-derived neurotropic factor that was being released that was causing or in part participating in the growth of these neurons, new neurons in the hippocampus, and then they would begin to die off. But if the mouse was in this enriching environment where it would be thinking, where it would be intellectually engaged, then it's as if the brain said, oh, we're going to be needing some neurons, okay, now do something with them. And if the mouse did something with them, then they stuck and they became integrated in only about a month into the neural network of this mouse. So we found that mice who had these enriching environments had the neuronal growth, and when they then were, along with mice that didn't have the enriching environment, were all plopped into the water, where they would, after one trial, learn, oh, there is this place that I can swim to and find my safety. Those mice who had the enriching environment had the more neurons in the hippocampus that remained, and then were actually better at that task. That is, they were smarter, they were better learners as a result of that experience. So this is showing not only that there's neurogenesis, the growth of neurons, but actually it results in enhanced learning and effectiveness at what we're doing. Now, in humans, because everyone always is saying, well, that's interesting in mice, and it's suggestive for sure, but we found in humans as well that throughout the lifespan in the hippocampus, neurons will grow. And of course, the assumption is that if we are thinking, if we're intellectually engaged, they will stick. And it was some very interesting research that probably can't be replicated for a long time because it involved cancer patients who ultimately died because that's the way you could assess the growth of these neurons in the hippocampus. But the idea was that they injected a dye into these patients. It had nothing to do with the study for this purpose. It just happened that the researchers said, oh my goodness, there's this phenomenal thing going on, the way that they're trying to see whether or not new cancer cells are growing or what's going on with the growth of cells in these people who have cancer. And then when they passed away, they were able to look and see in the hippocampus, because this chemical that was introduced called BDRU or BRDU would then mark these cells, and they found growth of neurons in the hippocampus. So this is a major neuroplastic finding of the growth of neurons. Now, in the meditation context, because this was exercise that resulted in the mice case, and this was just living life in the other case of humans, that is, they're constantly growing, that we've had research where we've looked at the effects of meditation on brain activity.